Hello, everybody, and welcome to SOAR's fifth Psych Talk of the semester. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Dr. Ling, for joining us today as well. We are all excited to hear about your research. Today's Psych Talk is sponsored by an ODEI grant awarded to Drs. Brandilén Villarreal and Maria Inturbide. A little bit about our speaker. Dr. Ling is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice and Criminalistics at the California State University, Los Angeles. She holds a Ph.D. in criminology from the University of Pennsylvania with a certificate in social, cognitive, and affective neuroscience. After graduating with honors from the University of California, Irvine with a bachelor's in psychology and social behavior, she spent approximately 2 years conducting clinical research in the UC Irvine Medical Center in the neuropsychiatry department. Her interdisciplinary research focuses on biological, psychological, and/or social factors that contribute to the development and treatment of various antisocial behaviors, including psychopathy, aggression, suicidality, and criminal behaviors across the lifespan, and considers the corresponding clinical, legal, and social implications. She has over 20 peer-reviewed publications, and her work has appeared in the media, including primetime national documentary series such as PBS Nova and The Future is Fantastic. Please help me welcome Dr. Ling.
Thank you so much, Edgar. I'm going to see if I can share my screen right now. If this will work. So hopefully you can see my title slide, just checking in. Yep.
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you all for having me here. Looks like someone else is joining. So as Edgar mentioned, my name is Dr. Ling. I am an assistant professor in the School of Criminal Justice and Criminalistics at California State University, Los Angeles. I am really excited to talk about my research today, which falls under the realm of biopsychosocial criminology. So for my talk, I will be going over some of the work that I've done using biopsychosocial approaches to understanding criminal behavior and antisocial behavior broadly. So to give you a sense of what I'll be talking about today, I will first introduce you to biopsychosocial criminology and the type of work that I do. I will then talk more specifically about some of my work, and in particular, I'll be talking about my work studying the brains of white-collar criminals and the brains of callous-unemotional children. And then I'm going to end the talk by talking a little bit about the implications of this type of research. So to start off, I wanted to give some context as to what biopsychosocial criminology is. You may have noticed in my title that I used the words antisocial behavior. So out of curiosity, what do you think antisocial behavior is? Go ahead and unmute yourself if you would like to respond.
I would say having to kind of go along with the behaviors with the diagnosis of antisocial disorder.
Yes, absolutely. So usually when we're thinking about antisocial behavior, at least in a clinical sense, we're really thinking about behaviors that are related to rule breaking and norm breaking actions that tend to harm or at least lack consideration for the well-being of other people and ourselves. And so I'm going to, in my talk, be using antisocial behavior as an umbrella term to capture a lot of different behaviors that might fall under this type of definition. So thinking about things like criminal behavior, aggression, psychopathy, things like that. So the biopsychosocial approach is to study these types of behaviors by considering biological, psychological, and social influences or factors. So biological factors might include things like the brain or genetics and others. Psychological factors might include things like personality traits, mental health conditions, and more. And then lastly, social factors can include things like family environment, peer groups, and others. So biopsychosocial researchers such as myself will examine these types of influences separately and or in conjunction with one another. But ultimately, we recognize that all of these different aspects are related to each other and can influence each other and contribute to the development progression of antisocial behavior. So for example, you might have a person who's low income. And so that falls under socioeconomic status. That is a social factor. And because of their low income status, perhaps they aren't able to get the nutrition that they need. And so that's going to impact how well their brain develops. And the brain is a biological factor. And if the brain is not being developed properly, then maybe that's going to impair how well the person's able to regulate their emotions, which is a psychological factor. And then if they're not able to regulate their emotions well, then maybe they're more likely to act out and lash out toward other people. So maybe they're more likely to be aggressive or violent. So there are ways in which these different factors, again, relate to each other and can contribute to antisocial types of behavior. So in my talk today, I will be focusing on biological factors, and in particular, I will be focusing on the brain. I chose to talk about biological factors because, at least in the criminal justice and criminology field, this area tends to not be talked about much, or at least not as much as psychological and social factors. But I do think it's important to think about the role that biological factors can play in the development and progression and treatment of antisocial behavior. But this is not the extent of my work. And in fact, my research does examine a lot of different behaviors in various ways. And to give you a sense, on this slide, I've provided an overview of some of the work that I've done. This is not comprehensive, but I wanted to show you how broad this can be. So each column is a behavior that I've studied. Each row is a type of factor or influence that I've examined in relation to that behavior. So for example, when it comes to biological influences, a lot of my work has been on the brain. So I've looked at brain mechanisms for psychopathy and aggression and criminal behavior and general antisocial behavior. For psychological factors, I've looked at things like emotional intelligence in psychopathic individuals. For social factors, I've looked at public perceptions of offenders who exhibit self-harming or self-injurious thoughts and behaviors like suicidality. So again, for this talk, I will be focusing on brain mechanisms for criminal behavior and callous-unemotionality, which is related to psychopathy. But if you do have any questions about some of these other projects or other things that I might be working on that are not listed here, please feel free to ask during the Q&A, or you can follow up with me after the talk by emailing me. So to give you a background for how we started thinking about the relevance of the brain in terms of criminal behavior, I was wondering how many of you have heard of Phineas Gage? Yeah, I'm seeing some nods. Good, good. So for those who are not familiar with Phineas Gage was an American railroad construction foreman. And one day in 1848, he was involved in a work-related accident. He was using an iron rod to try to pack explosive powder into a hole, but unfortunately that powder detonated, and that iron rod, which by the way was 43 inches long and had a diameter of 1.25 inches, so it was a pretty thick and long rod, that rod shot upward in that explosion. And when it shot upward, it ended up penetrating his left cheek, tore through his brain, exited his skull, and landed 80 feet away. So this image right here shows the injury that he sustained when he was hit with the iron rod. And it also shows you the path that the iron rod took when it shot through his head. So he did miraculously survive his injuries. And this is him posing with the iron rod that shot through his head. And even at the time when he was injured, he was actually able to speak and walk to a nearby cart to be taken into town to see a doctor for his injuries. Although he did survive, the injury he sustained resulted in significant personality and behavioral changes. So whereas before the accident, he was described as being really dependable and capable and trustworthy, after the accident, he was described as disrespectful, impulsive, and violent. And these effects were so profound that those who knew him described him as, quote, no longer Gage, end quote. In other words, he seemed like a completely different person. Phineas Gage is sometimes considered the man who started neuroscience because his case is supposedly the first to suggest that there was a link between brain injury and personality and behavioral changes. But at the time, it was still unclear the extent to which the brain was related to criminal or antisocial behaviors. However, in recent years, there has been increasing evidence that the brain is relevant in understanding criminal and antisocial behaviors broadly. So in addition to the case of Phineas Gage, you might hear the story about Mr. Oft. And if you haven't heard the story of Mr. Oft, I'll give a brief summary for what his story was. Mr. Oft was a 40-year-old school teacher who one day in 2000 suddenly started experiencing increasingly deviant sexual interests, including an interest in child pornography, which he allegedly had never been interested in before. He, at the time, had no prior history of sexual misconduct, but he soon started soliciting sex workers and collecting pornographic material, particularly inappropriate pornographic material that were focused on children and adolescents. And he tried to keep these hidden. He eventually did attempt to molest his 12-year-old stepdaughter and was quickly reported to the authorities and was found guilty of child molestation. He was given two choices for punishment. Either he could try to attend a 12-step sexual addiction program, or he would face jail time. He really did not want to go to jail, so he opted to try to complete the sexual addiction program, but he could not inhibit his sexual responses even while in the program. So he would try to solicit sexual favors from female staff and other clients and other patients at the rehabilitation center. So because of his behavior, he was kicked out of the program, and he was supposed to prepare to spend some time incarcerated. However, the night before his sentencing, he was rushed to the hospital because he was experiencing a severe headache and was expressing suicidal ideation and had said that he was afraid of raping his landlady. So he was hospitalized, and the day after he was admitted to the hospital, he started exhibiting other problematic symptoms. So he had balance problems, he started stumbling around when he was walking, his head was also starting to twitch when he walked, he would pee in his pants and didn't seem to care. He also started having problems writing. And so this prompted doctors to give him a full neurological examination, including an MRI, which is a type of brain scan. And when they conducted this brain scan, they found out that he had this large tumor growing in the front part of his brain. And you can see images here. These are the MRI images of his brain with the tumor. And after discovering this tumor, they did have it surgically removed. Within a few days of having the tumor removed, he was back to walking normally, he regained bladder control, and the sexually deviant interests seemed to go away. He was eventually released from the hospital and was able to re-enroll in a Sexaholics Anonymous program, which he successfully completed. And several months later, it was decided that he was no longer a threat, and so he was able to return home. However, about a year later, he started experiencing a persistent headache again and started feeling sexually deviant again. So he went back to the doctors, and after another brain scan, they found out that this tumor was starting to grow back. So once again, they surgically removed the tumor, and after they removed the tumor, those sexual urges went away. So this story gets told sometimes because there is debate about how relevant the tumor should be when thinking about the appropriate types of legal sanctions that Mr. Off should have experienced. And on the one hand, there does seem to be evidence that this tumor played some sort of role in the inappropriate behaviors that he was exhibiting. But on the other hand, Mr. Oft himself admitted that he did do those inappropriate things, and at some level, while he was doing them, he did realize or recognize that they were wrong and that they were inappropriate. So this story about the brain playing a role in criminal behavior is not unique. And in fact, there have been increasing arguments about the brain, and it's becoming much more common in legal settings. So I think it is important for us as a society generally, and especially as individuals who might be going into fields related to this, to start increasing our understanding about how the brain and other biological factors can contribute to different types of behavior. And one thing that I think is really important, especially in a legal context, is to think about how much do we really know about the criminal brain or the antisocial brain? And indeed, in the past few decades, there has been increasing research looking at antisocial brains, looking at other biological factors. And at least with the brain, there is some evidence that antisocial individuals might have a brain that looks a little bit different than non-antisocial individuals. So in these images that I will be showing next, you will see some PET scans. So it's a different kind of brain scan, but a PET scan helps us to see how well a brain is functioning. So previously with Mr. Off's scans, those were structural scans where you can see shapes and you can see sizes. With these, we're really thinking about the activity in the brain, and warmer colors are going to mean more activity in the brain. And the images that I'll show are positioned such that you are basically imagining that you are viewing a person's brain as they are lying on their back, looking up toward the ceiling. And you're looking basically through the top of their skull in order to see their brain. So in a normal, I'm going to show you the brain of murderers in this case. In normal non-murdering individuals, you're going to have a brain pattern that looks something like this. So we can see this sort of clear outline of the brain, and we see these sort of red hot spots near the top, and that's basically the front of the brain, the frontal lobe area. This is in contrast to the brain of, say, a murderer that looks something like this. We see that that clear outline is not as clear for a murderer, and we're missing that sort of hot spot, especially at the front of the brain. And this front part of the brain, the frontal lobe, is really important for higher order cognitive functions and helping us to regulate our behavior so that we do behave in socially appropriate ways. So in this case, we see that this murderer, that part of their brain does not seem to be functioning as well as it should be. So like as I've mentioned, there are several ways to study the brain. This is a PET scan. We've also seen an MRI scan. This scan shows brain function, but there are brain scans that show other features of the brain, such as size and shape. And in the two studies that I'll be talking about next, I am going to be talking about the sizes of different parts of the brain. And the reason why I'm focusing on brain structure by talking about brain size is because structural brain scans are actually more often used in court, and the general public, such as potential jury members, they tend to view structural brain images as being more causally relevant to behavior compared to functional brain images. So keep that in mind for the next two studies that I'll be talking about, because those next two studies, again, are thinking about brain structure, not brain function. With that background in mind, I wanted to talk about two particular studies that I've conducted where I have examined the brains of subtypes of antisocial individuals. So the first study I conducted was because I was interested in thinking about how the brain of white-collar offenders might differ from conventional offenders. Now, I do want to ask, when you think of white-collar offenders, what sort of characteristics do you think they have?
They're probably more organized than the conventional offender.
Yep, more organized. Anything else?
Maybe more educated.
Yep. Yeah. So it turns out that if you actually do research on white-collar criminality, there is not a clear and consistent definition of what white-collar offenders are. But in general, when we're thinking about white-collar offenders, the way that people have described them is they are people who have committed white-collar offenses, and white-collar offenses are offenses that tend to be related to deception and violations of trust. And white-collar offending in general is actually very understudied. There's not much research on white-collar criminals compared to other groups of individuals. But as you've all pointed out, there are these general conceptions of white-collar criminals. So these conceptions of white-collar criminals include things like being more organized, being from a potentially more advantageous background. And overall, these conceptualizations suggest that white-collar criminals might have characteristics that are different from conventional offenders in several ways. And in general, white-collar offenders tend to be thought of as being more predatory, and they're able to delay gratification, for example, whereas conventional offenders, research has shown, tend to be more impulsive, more emotionally reactive, and they tend to be more likely to go after immediate gratification. So there are these conceptual differences between conventional offenders and white-collar offenders. And so my colleagues and I were thinking about whether there could be brain differences between these types of offenders that might help to explain the different types of offending that they engage in. And in particular, we were interested in looking at the front part of the brain called the frontal lobe, and we hypothesized that there could be differences in this area because this area is called the executive center of the brain, and it's involved in a lot of higher order cognitive functions, so things like attention, regulating behavior, decision-making, things like that. So we were thinking that perhaps this part of the brain was really important, especially for white collar offending. And whereas previous research has suggested that conventional offenders have a smaller frontal lobe, we were hypothesizing that perhaps white collar offenders have a larger frontal lobe because they might be using that part of their brain more. And because there is evidence that the brain kind of works like a muscle, such that the more you use it, the bigger it develops relative to other areas, it could be that these offenders need to use that brain area more in order to successfully engage in these types of offenses. And indeed, so we were hypothesizing that they had a bigger frontal region, and we did find evidence that individuals with white collar who engaged in white collar offending did seem to have a bigger frontal lobe. And in particular, there were two specific brain regions that seemed to be related to white collar offending. They were the superior frontal gyrus and the anterior cingulate cortex. And I've listed some general processes that these two brain regions are involved in. And overall, they seem to be relevant to white collar offending. So white collar offending, again, is based on deception. And here you have a brain area that is really key in deceptive acts. You also have brain regions that are involved in things like cognitive reappraisal, which is an emotion regulation strategy that involves lessening the emotional impact of a stressful or a negative situation by reframing it. And again, you have these brain regions that are involved in regulating behavior. And so they might help to explain why white collar offenders are able to carry out the types of crimes that they do. Now, this isn't the only work that I've done where I've looked at subtypes of antisocial individuals. And in the second study that I'll briefly talk about, we were interested in understanding gender differences in callous-unemotional traits in children. And callous-unemotional traits are characteristics that are to an extent related to psychopathy. So when you think about psychopaths, what kind of features do you think about? What kind of features do you think a psychopathic individual would have? Yep, dark triad. So one of the key features, key characteristics of psychopathic individuals tends to be their affective impairments. So they don't necessarily seem to understand and experience emotions the same way that non-psychopathic individuals do. And we can actually see some of these impairments earlier in life. And we refer to them as callous-unemotional traits in children. So children can exhibit some of these emotional or affective impairments. You can see that some children tend to exhibit a lack of guilt, an absence of empathy. They might sort of callously use other people to for their own gain or for their own benefit. And these characteristics tend to be relatively stable across childhood and adolescence. And individuals with callous-unemotional traits tend to have an earlier onset of behavioral problems and engage in more severe forms of antisocial behavior. So we were interested in thinking about potential biological differences between males and females with callous-unemotional traits, because males are more likely to have callous-unemotional traits and are more likely to exhibit higher levels of callous-unemotional traits. And in this study, the brain region that we were interested in was the amygdala. And the amygdala is a brain region that has been implicated in callous-unemotional traits. Each person has two amygdala. One is on the left side of the brain and one is on the right side of the brain. And this is a key region involved in emotion. So the amygdala is involved in emotion-related processes such as emotional control, fear response, interpreting non-verbal emotional expressions. And so it could be that perhaps impairments in this part of the brain could be related to the callous-unemotional traits that we observe. So we were interested in seeing how amygdala size was related to callous-unemotional traits in males and females. And when we looked at the brains of children with low levels of callous-unemotional traits, we found that there was a pattern of amygdala asymmetry. So we were comparing the size of the left and the size of the right. And we found that for females, the size of the left and right amygdala were statistically the same. There was no statistical difference. However, for males, the right amygdala was statistically larger than the left amygdala. And this pattern is actually similar to what we see in typically developing youth. So youth that don't have callous-unemotional traits. However, when we looked at youth who had high levels of callous-unemotional traits, we actually saw the opposite pattern emerge. So for females, we actually saw that the right was significantly larger than the left. But for males, that significant difference was not there. So we do see this almost basically opposite pattern in the amygdala size between males and females with high versus low callous-unemotional traits. And we thought that these findings were interesting because they suggest that there are these neurodevelopmental differences between males and females with high and low callous-unemotional traits. And these divergent patterns that we see could reflect neurodevelopmental differences that are important to consider because they might reflect disrupted biological developmental processes. And if we think about a neurodevelopmental framework for understanding different types of behaviors, especially behaviors, problematic behaviors that emerge early in life, this does seem to align with different theoretical perspectives, such as those offered by Terry Moffat, for example, that suggest that individuals might have neuropsychological abnormalities that are underlying the early onset behavioral problems that persist throughout development, throughout adolescence and into adulthood. So again, we see this neurodevelopmental difference, and this suggests that perhaps biological factors are really important to consider when we're thinking about how these problematic behaviors are developing and progressing. So I want to wrap up by talking about some of the implications of this work. And overall, I hope that my talk has given you some evidence that it can be important to consider biological differences among different types of antisocial individuals. And overall, I do believe that biopsychosocial approaches in general can help to provide a more holistic understanding of different types of behaviors. I think biopsychosocial approaches are also a way of recognizing the importance of nature and nurture. So take the brain, for example. The brain is a biological factor, but you can think of it as a consequence of nature and nurture because part of its development is based on genetics, which is nature, but it is also impacted by environmental factors such as nutrition and head trauma and things like that, which is nurture. Additionally, we can think about different risk and protective factors using biopsychosocial approaches. So even if someone has a biological impairment or a biological risk, such as a brain injury, there could be social factors that protect an individual from becoming antisocial or criminal. And similarly, someone who might experience a lot of social risks, such as growing up in a violent household, they might have biological factors that protect them from becoming antisocial or criminal. When we're thinking about theoretical implications, incorporating biological factors into theories of antisocial behavior or antisocial individuals can, again, facilitate a more complete understanding of these behaviors and these types of individuals, and can provide insight into different etiological mechanisms for subtypes of antisocial behaviors. So in this case, I talked about white collar versus conventional offending. Even if the brain is involved in criminal behavior broadly, it can give us insight into how the brain is related to criminal behavior. And so again, in this case, we found that conventional offenders, they tend to have a smaller frontal lobe, but white collar offenders actually don't. They actually have a larger frontal lobe, which could contribute to differences in offending. When we're thinking about clinical and policy implications, I think biopsychosocial factors can help us to identify at-risk individuals. It can help to provide insight into treatment options and explaining why certain treatments are more effective for certain types of people. I have an image here that shows a method of brain stimulation called high-definition transcranial direct current stimulation. This method of brain stimulation involves using small electrodes that are placed on a person's scalp, and a very weak electrical current is run through the electrodes to try to manipulate the level of activity in certain parts of the brain. This technique has been used to treat different clinical disorders like depression, but in recent years, I and others have tried to use this type of technique to see whether we could help to reduce antisocial behaviors such as aggression by changing brain activity. And lastly, thinking about legal implications, I think recognizing biological differences among antisocial individuals and thinking about how biological, psychological, and social factors might play a role in antisocial behaviors can provide insights into how to appropriately respond to criminal and other antisocial behaviors. It gives us an opportunity to think about the validity of assumptions that we're making about free will and criminal responsibility and blameworthiness. And I think it is an opportunity to prompt legal actors such as judges and juries and lawyers to give more consideration toward rehabilitation efforts based on an individual's needs and risk factors. So we've already seen ways in which biological factors have played an important role in the legal system. And the example that I give here is the judicial rulings that made life without parole unconstitutional for individuals younger than 18. Part of the justification for those cases included language about brain development. So we can see that there are ways that considering biological factors can provide guidance for appropriate legal actions. So if you're interested in reading the details of the studies that I've mentioned here, these are the citations for the 2 studies. If you have more questions, or if you want to follow up with me about any of the topics that I discussed today, feel free to email me, sling@calstla.edu. And with that, I will conclude my talk. Thank you so much for listening, and I will take questions.
Do we have any questions for Dr. Ling?
I have a question. So you highlighted that there is a difference between the brains of white-collar criminals and then conventional criminals. I'm just curious if you have any insight as to why the frontal lobe is more developed as opposed to like other areas of the brain.
Yeah, great question. I think that it, in part, if we think that using a particular brain region allows you to exercise that part of the brain and such that it's sort of developing more, I think the frontal lobe is involved in a lot of processes that are really helpful for white collar offending, whereas other parts of the brain might not be as relevant. So perhaps those parts of the brain are not being activated as much. So it's not being exercised, so it's not being developed as much.
I had a question. When doing these studies and collecting data, how hard was it to collect people from certain communities or populations? Was it difficult to get in contact with these people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I think it is a little bit harder to do just because you know, with these, at least, we were scanning brains, and so not everyone is comfortable getting their brain scanned, not everyone is eligible to get their brain scanned, and so there is a bit of a selection bias in terms of who actually can participate and complete the study. It's also a bit hard because we were trying to use members of the community. So we weren't necessarily going into prisons, for example, and recruiting prisoners for the study. We were just recruiting from the general community. So the first study, the white collar study, we actually were recruiting from the general LA area. The other study with children, that was done in Philadelphia. But you want to make sure that you have enough variation in your antisocial behavior in order to actually study that behavior. One strategy that we used in order to ensure that we were getting antisocial individuals is we were recruiting from temporary employment agencies, not necessarily the people who are working at temporary employment agencies, but people who are trying to find work through temporary employment agencies, because there are certain characteristics of antisocial individuals that might make it hard for them to hold down a job and to have steady employment. And there has been research that has suggested that when you are recruiting from temporary employment agencies, as we did, you are going to get higher levels of antisocial behavior and individuals that tend to be more antisocial. So we were able to have some individuals who were engaging in criminal behavior, some who were pretty psychopathic. So these really sort of higher levels of antisocial behavior that we were looking for, which was really helpful. But it is challenging and it does take time. And, to an extent, we were trying to also verify information because people may or may not be forthcoming with the types of criminal behavior, for example. And so we were trying to look into official records, for example, just to see how consistent that information was. Yeah, so great question. The question was, as we move toward a fully mature brain in adulthood, there are more connections between the prefrontal cortex and parts of the limbic system. Is this something that also looks different for those with high antisocial behavior? And the answer is yes, although it kind of depends on the antisocial group you're looking at. And these are just very broad general differences. So if you just imagine a normal curve, you are going to have some overlap. So there are going to be some antisocial individuals whose brains kind of look more like normal individuals, and you're going to have some normal individuals whose brains might look more antisocial. So there is overlap there, and we're not necessarily able to just use a brain scan to diagnose anyone with some sort of antisocial condition. But we do see other differences throughout the brain, both in terms of connectivity, as well as function, as well as structure. And for example, there are some individuals whose prefrontal cortex, so this front part of the brain here, it's not as fully developed, but then their limbic system, which is really involved, really important in things like emotion and things like that. They might be overly active, for example, and because their frontal region is not as well developed as it should be, it might have a harder time sort of controlling the limbic system, for example. You might also have some individuals, such as psychopathic individuals, who their prefrontal cortex can look normal, but then their limbic system, for example, might be underdeveloped. So they might have smaller amygdala, their amygdala might not be functioning well. And so there are all these different profiles of like brain patterns and connectivity and functioning based on the type of antisocial behavior that you're looking at.
It's really interesting, because then it's almost like for some individuals that don't have that top-down control where the prefrontal cortex is able to override the limbic system, then it almost still looks like an adolescent type of brain, right?
Yep. Yeah, and I think that it could also help to explain why certain antisocial individuals are more impulsive, and if you have them in like an emotionally volatile situation, they might be engaging in decision making that might be more similar to what we see in adolescence. And just like adolescents as well, if you can have them in sort of a calm state, you give them a lot of time to really think about what it is that they're doing, and it's just a cognitive exercise, they can tell you what's right or wrong, or what they should do or shouldn't do, but sometimes they can't seem to control their behavior. So if you talk to some of these individuals, they'll say, I know I shouldn't do that, but I couldn't help it. And so it's this idea of there's this disconnect between the cognitive part of their brain, and then like this more emotional and impulsive part of the brain, and they might not be coordinating as well as they should.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, then thank you, Dr. Ling, for talking about your research with us. It was really interesting. We really appreciate it. And thank you everybody for coming. This concludes our SOAR meeting.